Hello, everyone. I would like to thank all of you for attending the webinar today. My name is Altaf Halde. I'm the Global Business Head at Network Intelligence. We are a 20-year-old cybersecurity services provider, and one of the most important pillars of a service offering is the strategy, risk, and advisory services. Under this domain, we specifically offer services to customers on various regulations that impact them. These regulations are country driven as well as specific function driven. In today's webinar, we are going to speak about the all important Consumer Protection Regulation, or CPR as it's commonly known, which has been released by the Central Bank of UAE. In specific context to Article number 6, which speaks about privacy of user data and rights. That is what we are going to cover today. So I'm looking forward to an interesting session. And without taking much of your time, I would like to introduce the speaker for today. We have Nikhil Raj Singh, who's the principal consultant in the Strategy, Risk and Advisory Division at Network Intelligence. He has been with the firm for more than 6.5 years. In these 6.5 years, he has not only achieved a lot of certifications for himself, but also has helped a lot of organizations, more than 100 organizations globally, to build robust and sustainable information security programs. And he has also helped them achieve compliances for various information security standards and which cater to multiple industry verticals. Also, he has a very fond interest of imparting this knowledge to other people. So he has been conducting a lot of trainings. And at last count, he has trained more than 1,000 students across various domains on various topics related to the strategy, risk, and advisory. His core strength lies in the governance, risk, and compliance. So I am looking forward to a lot of important inputs from Nikhil Raj Singh, which will be of use to all of us in this very important CPR law of the Middle East, United Arab Emirates. So without taking much time, I now hand it over to Nikhil to take it forward.
Thank you, Altaf. Hello, everyone. This is Nikhil Raj Singh. Currently working as a principal consultant in the strategy and risk advisory team, Network Intelligence. And I'll be your host for today for conducting this particular webinar on the consumer protection regulation, which was released by the Central Bank of UAE. So before starting the webinar, these are the high-level pointers that we would be covering in today's webinar. So we would start with understanding what exactly is this regulation, what is the objective of this regulation, which particular organizations does this regulation apply to, and what are different articles of the regulations. And then we will specifically focus on Article 6, which talks about the protection of consumer data and assets. So this is the article which is very relevant for us as a cybersecurity professional in today's world. So that's where our focus of the webinar would be. And after that, we would give you a brief overview of the services in regards to this particular regulation, where Network Intelligence can pitch in and help you be compliant to this particular regulation. And after that, we'll open the floor for any questions that you might have around this particular regulation. So without wasting any further time, very quickly, the Central Bank of UAE, the primary objective of the Central Bank of UAE is to establish regulations and standards for protection of consumers of licensed financial institutions. And that is the reason, as part of their own responsibility of the Central Bank of UAE, they have come up with this particular regulation, which is known as the Consumer Protection Regulation. And it's a regulatory framework which is specifically applicable for licensed financial institutions. Now, who are licensed financial institutions? That we will cover in the further slides of the webinar. But for now, just understand the fact that this has been released by the Central Bank of UAE because their responsibility is to protect the consumer's interest. And as part of that responsibility, they have come up with this particular regulation. Now, consumer protection regulation is usually supported by the consumer protection standard, which ideally defines the regulatory requirements for consistent interpretation and implementation of this regulation's principle. The regulation ideally is intended to ensure protection of consumers' interest in their use of any financial product and or service or any relationship that the consumer might have with any of the licensed financial institutions. Basis that, there is a clear-cut objective of the regulation which has been defined by the Central Bank of UAE, and its applicability is also being defined by the Central Bank of UAE. So the objective of the regulation is to protect consumers and contribute to the overall stability of the financial services industry. What it means is this is a regulation which has been built to protect two things. One, of course, is the consumer's interest, and the other one is to add stability in the financial services industry of the region. Now, this includes a lot of objectives. This includes a lot of pointers and parameters under this umbrella, some of which are setting the standards of the business and the markets as conducted by the licensed financial institutions, the governance and oversight of the overall design, the promotion of the services, the sale of financial products, and all of that is included under the objective of this regulation. Then promoting responsible financial practices to protect consumers from becoming over-indebted. What would be the quality of the service and the products to be provided to the consumers? And then providing consumers a freedom to access their information which is collected as part of the consumers consuming the service or a financial product from the LFIs. And then if there are any barriers in limiting fair competition to the multiple players which are there in the LFI sector for the UAE, and promoting awareness, consumer knowledge, and consumers' ability to take informed decision based on the information provided by the LFIs, so that the consumer is ready to assess the financial product and service and take an informed decision whether or not to go for that particular service or a product offered by a licensed financial institution. On the applicability, like I said in the first slide itself, this is applicable to all the LFIs licensed by the Central Bank of UAE. And so if you are an organization which has got a license from the Central Bank of UAE as a financial institution, then this particular consumer protection regulation would be applicable to your business, and you will have to make sure that you have programs and controls deployed in your organizations to achieve compliance to this particular regulation. Now, who are LFIs is the next point of discussion. So LFIs generally includes banks and other financial institutions that are given license by the Central Bank of UAE to provide financial activities. This would cover both if you are an organization that gives financial products, and if you are an organization that gives financial services, you would be categorized as LFI if you have received a license from the Central Bank of UAE. Some of the examples generally would be any national bank, any foreign bank, financial companies, exchange businesses, payment service providers, investment banks, wholesale banks, monetary intermediaries. So all of these would generally classified as LFIs, and this regulation would be applicable to them as part of the compliance. So with that being said, since we have already covered the objective, applicability, and we now also understand who are LFIs, we would now have a look at how the regulation is being structured by the Central Bank of UAE. So the regulation has 15 different articles. Out of those 15 articles, it's a mix in terms of articles which are directly related to how an organization is supposed to conduct business, how an organization is supposed to push products to the consumer. Then there are articles which talk about consumers' education and awareness. Then there are articles which talk about financial inclusion. So out of these 15 articles, 14 articles are more or less inclined toward how the industry or how an organization in the financial industry is supposed to function in a fair and transparent manner. And one of the article, which is Article 6, is specifically responsible for covering the data privacy, protection of the consumer's data, and the consumer's right. So in our presentation, we'll cover Article 1 to 15. We'll give you an overview of which article covers what specific pointers. but we will give you more details around Article 6 because that is going to be the point of focus for us in this particular webinar. So Article 1, of course, like in any other regulation, it's an article that provides you definitions of all the words and terminologies that have been used in the regulation. Disclosure and transparency is the another article, which expects the organizations to provide consumers all the information necessary for them to take an informed decision on a product or a service. Then institutional oversight, market conduct and business conduct. The institutional oversight article is to promote positive institutional conduct in serving all consumers fairly. Market conduct is to sell and provide consumers with appropriate products and services in accordance with the principle of the regulation. And then Article 6 that we will cover in the later slide in more detail. So we would skip this for now. Responsible financing practice, complaint management and complaint resolution. So this is to have a fair, accessible and transparent process wherein consumers can come in, lodge their complaints, and then they are provided sufficient resolutions from the organization with regards to the complaint launched. Then consumer education and awareness, where the central bank expects them also along with the licensed financial institutions to work together so that the awareness with regards to the services and products and their inherent risk, whether it's a financial risk or any other risk, is also communicated to the consumers of the product or service. Then financial inclusion, CEDA compliance of our financial services, conflict with other regulations, enforcement and sections, interpretation of regulations, and the publication and effective date. So if you see out of these 15 articles from the cybersecurity standpoint, the one article which is most important is the protection of consumer data and assets. Rest all the articles are more or less towards how an organization is supposed to function and how an organization is supposed to function specifically in the financial industry for providing financial products and services. So, like I said, what we'll do is we will go into more details of what is expected in the Article 6 of the regulation, which is to protect the consumer data and the assets that generally an organization might get exposed to as part of providing these services or the products. So the Article 6 of CPR has a clear-cut guideline given in the regulation itself in terms of what is expected from the organizations to achieve compliance to this particular article of the regulation. So what is the intent of this particular article? The intent of this particular article is to make sure that whatever data is being captured of a consumer to provide product or services and information, if it is being captured as part of providing services and products, is handled in a secure manner. Now, what is covered under secure manner is these 7 pointers. The LFIs ideally must establish a function in their organization that is ideally responsible for data management and protection. So this would include an organization set up a program or to set up an function or to set up a team that is responsible for maintaining policies, procedures, systems, and controls to protect consumers' personal data and information against a normal threat of misuse, unauthorized access, undue processing, or analysis. So that is the first intent of this Article 6 of the Consumer Protection Regulation. The other expectation is to have policies that specify the duration of record keeping. So which means whatever information or whatever data or whatever records you are keeping of the consumer, the organization must have a policy that specifies the duration of this record keeping and their data retention in accordance with applicable laws and regulations. Now you'll have to understand the fact that the regulation does not specify a specific period to be mentioned in the policy document. It says there has to be a policy which to talk about and specify a duration basis the applicable laws, regulations, and business. So if there is a regulation which talks about keeping financial records for a period of 7 years, let's say in UAE, then you will have to adhere to that duration and make sure that your policy, the duration is specified in your policy is aligned to that particular law or regulation. So in the CPR, there is no specific duration which is mentioned, but it points to other regional laws or regulation to identify and come up with the correct duration that needs to be mentioned in the data retention document. The next is to have appropriate security and monitoring measures. Now, these measures are supposed to be placed, these controls are supposed to be placed in the organization to detect and track any unauthorized internal access or use of consumer information. Any breach of access, misuse, or unauthorized release, it needs to be recorded, which means it needs to be recorded in a documented format, including any harm that can be done to the consumer by such breach by future. So in reporting, you'll have to then report to all of these to the central bank for their review. So any expected breach, any expected breach to the consumer data or information is supposed to be reported to the central bank. Now, what it means is all the licensed financial institutions must notify the central bank of all significant breaches of consumer data, which means if there is any significant consumer data breach, then the LFI must go out and report that to the central bank. And if that breach poses any risk to the financial and personal security of the consumer without any delay. What it means is if you identify that there has been a breach of the consumer data or information in my environment, and that breach can cause a risk which is related to financial risk or a personal security of the consumer, then without any delay, you will have to report that breach to the central bank of UAE. And they are also liable, the LFIs are also liable for reimbursing any direct cost incurred by the consumer for actual harm done as a result of the breach. Now here also, if you see, the regulation does not say what is that amount which they are liable to. What it says is any direct cost incurred by the consumer because of the breach, the financial institution then is liable for reimbursing that direct cost to the consumer. Licensed financial institutions must ensure that consumers are able to make informed choices with respect to the services and products. So what it means is the general principle which is there in any data privacy regulation or which is there in any data privacy regulation about taking consent of the user is what this regulation also expects organizations to follow. So LFIs will have to make sure that the consumers are able to make informed choices with respect to providing expressed consent on the data being collected, how it is being used, will it be shared with third parties, and will it be shared within the licensed financial institution? Will it be shared within across the teams, etc.? So all of that is to be covered as part of the control that the licensed financial institution is supposed to be implementing in the organization. So consent on data being collected, how it will be used, how it will be shared with third parties is something which is one of the key expectation of the regulation from the LFIs. Then, of course, the last but not the least requirement, which is licensed financial institutions must prevent the misuse of consumer information and data. So what this means is the organization, the LFI, which is providing services or products, they should have sufficient controls. They should have sufficient programs and governance inbuilt within the organizations to make sure that misuse of consumer information and data is prevented. So these are the 7 key areas, or these are the 7 key controls which are expected under Article 6 of CPR with regards to data privacy, cybersecurity, and the consumer data protection. So building policies and procedures and systems for data management and protection. Then there is a point which talks about data retention and record keeping. Then the monitoring and detection if there is any unauthorized access of the consumer user information. Then, of course, of the breaches, if there is a breach, the LFIs is supposed to be notifying the Central Bank of UAE. If the breach had occurred any direct cost to the consumer, then they'll be liable to reimburse that particular cost to the consumer. Then the clause about consent. to the consumers, so that their consumers are aware of how their data is being collected, used, and shared with any third parties. And last, which is the governance and a program which needs to be there in the organization in such a way that it prevents misuse of consumer information and data. So this is the gist of Article 6. If you comply to these 7 points, you would be complying to the Article 6 of Consumer Protection Regulation from the security standpoint. But for the other rest 14 articles, those will be separate. Those are more towards how you function as a business and how you provide services and products. So those are a completely different point of discussion altogether. Now, how network intelligence can help you as a LFI to meet compliance to this particular regulation? When we say with this particular regulation, we are only focusing on Article 6 of CPR because we are a cybersecurity firm, and our focus is on ensuring that organizations are compliant to the requirements within the regulation that talks about cybersecurity or data privacy. So one, of course, is we can provide you implementation assistance wherein we can have the documents, processes, policies, and procedures created for you to ensure that you have the data, you have the documents, policies, and processes available in your organization to comply to these 7 important pointers. We can also conduct something called as a gap assessment or an as-is study of your organization's security controls and data privacy control to see whether or not you as an organization comply to the Article 6 of CPR. Then we can help you create a governance framework, which is, of course, the most important point to get compliant to the last point of the Article 6 of CPR, wherein we said we'll set up a program that should cover the governance and other controls relevant for preventing misuse of consumer information and data. So we can help you come up with that governance framework. We can, of course, document all the policies and supporting procedures that are required. And we can also set up a training program. We can also give you a short training, or we can also give trainings to your team in understanding Article 6 of Consumer Protection Regulation, in understanding the policies and procedures and the program that you have set up in your organization for getting compliant to the Article 6 of CPR, so that everybody in the organization is on the same page when it comes to adherence to the Article 6 related requirements under the consumer protection regulations. So this is what we can help you with when it comes to making you compliant with the consumer protection regulations of the Central Bank of UAE. And you can, of course, reach out to us for any of these services if you are looking to get compliant to this particular regulation. So that is it from the discussion standpoint. What I'll do now is, if there are any questions, I'll go ahead and see in the chat box if there are any questions already available, and I'll have a discussion on those questions. And post that, we'll probably sign off from the webinar. So one of the questions that I have received is, are these laws applicable for international companies with clients located in UAE, or are these only meant for UAE based companies? So the answer to that is here. The regulation is applicable to licensed financial institutions. So if you are an organization which A, deals in financial activities, B, has got a license from the Central Bank of UAE to do the financial activities, which means to provide financial products or services. And if you fall in the category of any of these 8 type of organization, the regulation would be applicable to. So this is not how a normal, let's say, a data privacy regulation like GDPR decides the applicability, which is on the basis of where and how and what services do you provide with regards to the regulation. Here it specifically says that this is a category of organizations which are known as licensed financial institutions, which are providing financial activities, which would of course include providing financial products or services. And if they have got a license to do those activities from the Central Bank of UAE, then this particular regulation would be applicable to you. So you don't have to think where and to whom you are providing these services and which region, which geography. That is not a question. The question is whether or not you have a license from the central bank to provide financial activities or to do financial activities within UAE. And if you have, and if you fall under the categories of LFI, you will have to go ahead and comply to this particular regulation. So that was the first question. Okay. So can you explain in detail how network intelligence will help us and what's the typical duration of this activity? How high are the fines for non-compliance? See, so typical duration for this activity depends on what different type of service you choose for and how big your infrastructure is, what type of an organization you are. We can, of course, connect post the session to have a detailed discussion on it because it will be very difficult for me to give you exact duration. But let's say anywhere between 7 to 10 days is an ideal duration of this type of an engagement. If you are a, let's say, a medium-sized organization, medium-sized LFI. How high are the fines for non-compliance? So in the specific regulation, there is, like I said, in the Article 6 of CPR, it does not specify what is the fine for not being compliant to the regulation. So there are two things to liabilities when it comes to this particular regulation. One, of course, is reimbursing any direct cost that has been incurred by a consumer when there is a breach that has happened of a data. So if you face a data breach, and because of the data breach, if there is a direct financial loss which has been incurred by a consumer, then you will be liable for reimbursing the cost to the consumer. Now, this breach would obviously mean, so this cost would vary how big or impactful the breach is. So whether it covers 10,000 people or 1 lakh people or 10 lakh people. So depending upon that, your liability would increase. So that is one point which you'll have to be aware of. The other thing is the liability to not comply with other articles of the regulation. So one, of course, is Article 6, where it categorically says if the data breach has happened, you would go ahead and reimburse the direct cost which has been incurred by the consumer as part of the data breach. The other is what if you do not comply to other articles of the regulation? Then the penalty and the violation related discussion is under this article, which is the enforcement and sanctions, and that is the decision of which is directly taken by the Central Bank of UAE, and then accordingly the liabilities will be decided. The other question is how can consumer information be misused? So consumer information can be misused in many ways. It can be misused to do a financial fraud. It can be misused to do an identity fraud. It can be misused to present a personal risk to the consumer. So depending upon what is the type of information that has been breached as part of the data breach that an organization faces, the misuse of information then accordingly can be identified. Is this applicable for insurance consumers? So the question, of course, so if you are an insurance firm, you'll have to identify whether do you fall as a LFI which has got license from the central bank to do the financial activities. So if you are an investment company and you have got a license to act as a LFI, the regulation will be applicable to you. How can they prove the loss was related to the breach? Can that hold in court? So that is something which is completely a different point of discussion. So once a breach is identified and you report that breach to the Central Bank of UAE, Then, of course, there will be a procedure which will be followed by Central Bank of UAE to identify the reason of the breach, why it happened, what is the impact of the breach, etc., etc. Uh, Whether or not the consumers are directly affected, not affected, did the consumer face any direct cost as part of the breach. All of that will be taken as part of the decision or as part of the exercise which is conducted once you report your breach. So once you report your breach, it will be a set of discussions, it will be a set of investigations, inquiries, uh, review of the documents, review of the processes, etc., to understand who's at the fault and who's not at the fault. And then it will be decided what is the amount of liability which is coming on the licensed financial institution, if there is any. If there is not, of course, you would not be held liable. So it's completely based on how the activity is carried out after you report the breach and how the investigation and the discussions and the review pans out after you report the breach to the Central Bank of UAE. So I will stop sharing my screen for now just to see if there are any more questions that's which are there in the chat. I just give me okay. If we are service solutions provider for these LFIs, are we covered directly by the regulation? No. So if you are a services or solution provider for these LFIs, you are not the LFIs because you're just the service provider for the LFI. So the applicability of the regulation is on the organization to which you are providing services because they are the ones who have got the license from the Central Bank of UAE. So they are supposed to be compliant to this particular regulation. Of course, as part of the compliance, they would expect their service providers to follow XYZ controls in providing the services which they are getting from the service provider. So that those controls, those measures you will have to take as a service provider. But as a whole, whether or not the regulation applies to a service provider of a LFI, the answer is no. So that was the last question which I had received. So I have not got any other questions. So with that being said, thank you everyone for taking out time and joining the session. Okay, so there's one last question which I have received. What other services do you provide? So instead of I taking up this question, Altaf, are you on the call?
Yes, Nikhil.
So I would expect you to take up this question which I've received, which says, what other services do network intelligence provide? So I think you are the right person to answer that.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nikhil, for the wonderful session, and thanks to the entire audience for such interesting questions that they have actually put to us. So while we do not want to make a sales pitch, for network intelligence, but as the question has come, I'll probably just give you a quick overview. As I mentioned in the beginning, we are a 20-year-old cybersecurity services provider, and we provide services across all the domains of cybersecurity. So we start off with assessment, where we do the penetration testing, we do red team assessment. We also have a successful practice for OT security. Then we have the strategy, risk and advisory division, which is headed by Nikhil. Over here, we take care of a lot of compliances. We help companies achieve certifications. We are also a PCI QSA. Then we have the MDR function, which is the manage, detect and respond, which, where we provide SOC as a service to our customers. So we have got multiple SOCs across the globe, including a SOC in Dubai, as well as a SOC in Saudi Arabia. Then we have the products engineering or the professional services division, where we provide products, third-party products and services on leading cybersecurity technological products to our customers, where we help them with implementation, we help them with management, monitoring of those products. And we have the cybersecurity training division, where as all of you will agree that cybersecurity talent is very much in demand, but we don't have the right supply. So we have an institute where we impart training for professionals who want to make a career in cybersecurity. At the same time, we also help companies with customized cybersecurity training programs. So any organization, if they feel that they need to empower their team with some special skills, so we do that as well. And last, but also one of the most important part is that we have also developed a couple of our own products. One is FireSec, which is a firewall rule-based analysis tool. And the second is a big data security analytical platform called BlueScope, which is primarily used for active threat hunting and for CISO dashboard. So in a nutshell, we provide an end-to-end service offering to our customers in the cybersecurity domain. And the team that Nikhil and my other colleagues represent is part of a 500 plus strong team members spread across the globe, with India being one of our largest setup, followed by Middle East and the US, Europe. In Amsterdam, we have our operations, and Singapore, as well as in Australia and Sydney. So, that was my 2-minute reply to the question that Nikhil just asked. So over to you, Nikhil.
Thank you, Altaf. So I think that was the last question which I had received for this particular webinar. So once again, thank you all for joining in the webinar, for taking your time, and we hope we were able to provide you some details on the regulation. If there are any follow-up questions that you might have, you can of course write back to us using any of the channels. You can reach out to me, Altaf, or the Network Intelligence social media handles. You can drop emails to info@niaconsulting.com. And with that being said, we will hope to host you in another webinar, and have a happy week ahead. And we look forward to seeing you again. So thank you all, and have a great week ahead. Bye-bye.